Houston sits roughly 50 miles inland from open water, built on a flat, swampy coastal plain so low and so poorly drained that the ground barely slopes at all between downtown and the Gulf of Mexico. It has no natural deepwater port, no protective harbor, brutal summer humidity that regularly pairs 95-degree heat with dew points to match, and it sits directly in the path of the Gulf's hurricane season every single year. None of that stopped two brothers with $5,000 and a newspaper advertisement full of outright lies from deciding, in 1836, that this exact stretch of mosquito-infested bayou should become a city. Today, Houston is the fourth largest city in the United States, home to more Fortune 500 company headquarters than nearly anywhere else in the country, and the undisputed energy capital of the entire world. The status built entirely on a waterway that did not naturally exist until Houston's own citizens dug it themselves. This is the story of a city that looked at its own complete lack of natural advantages and simply built around every single one of them. The land that would become Houston had belonged for generations to the Karankawa and Atacapa peoples before two brothers from New York, Augustus Chapman Allen and John Kirby Allen, purchased roughly 6,600 acres along Buffalo Bayou in August 1836 for the sum of $5,000. Just months after, Texas had won its independence from Mexico at the Battle of San Jacinto, 25 miles away. The Allens were not settlers looking to farm the land themselves. They were land speculators, and they placed an advertisement in the Telegraph and Texas Register that August describing their new town of Houston, named in honor of General Sam Houston, the hero of San Jacinto and first president of the new Republic of Texas, in terms that were, by the honest admission of later historians, filled with outright exaggeration bordering on outright fabrication. The bayou they described as a reliable navigable waterway to the sea was, in reality, a shallow, twisting, snag-choked channel that any experienced river captain would have taken one look at and refused. That did not stop the Allens from securing Houston's designation, however briefly, as the temporary capital of the Republic of Texas in 1837, a political coup that gave their speculative paper town instant legitimacy and drew settlers who might otherwise never have given the swampy site a second look. The population reportedly grew from a dozen residents to 1,500 within 4 months of the town's founding, driven almost entirely by the promise of proximity to a new seat of government rather than anything the land itself actually offered. The Allens' most audacious bluff came due almost immediately, and remarkably, it worked. To prove Buffalo Bayou was navigable all the way to their new town site, the brothers first sent a small steamboat, the Laura, which reached Houston on January 22, 1837, docking near what is now known as Allen's Landing. Skeptics complained that a true test would require a much larger vessel, so the following June, the Allens hired Captain Edward Auld for $1,000 to pilot a considerably bigger steamer, the Constitution, up the same bayou from Galveston. Auld succeeded, but the bayou proved so narrow and winding that once he reached Houston, he could not physically turn the ship around, and was forced to run its engines in reverse for 6.5 miles until he found a stretch of water wide enough to complete the maneuver, a bend in the bayou still known today as Constitution Bend in honor of the ordeal. It was hardly a ringing endorsement of Houston's natural port credentials, but it was enough to establish, on paper at least, that ocean-going vessels could technically reach the new town, and cotton and lumber began moving through Houston's wharves toward the genuinely capable deepwater port 50 miles downstream at Galveston, then the largest, wealthiest, and most sophisticated city in the entire state of Texas. That arrangement, Houston as an inland trading post feeding cotton to Galveston's Superior Harbor, held for more than 60 years. And Houston's merchants spent much of that time chafing at their dependence on a rival port they did not control. In the late 1850s, they organized the Buffalo Bayou Ship Channel Company specifically to try reaching the sea without going through Galveston at all, and after the interruption of the Civil War, renewed the effort in 1869 by reorganizing as the Houston Direct Navigation Company and lobbying Congress successfully to designate Houston a federal port of delivery the following year. Progress remained agonizingly slow. The Army Corps of Engineers surveyed the bayou and recommended modest improvements to a width of 100 feet and a depth of just 6, but chronically inadequate federal appropriations meant those improvements crept forward at a pace measured in decades rather than years. Houston finally found a genuinely capable ally in 1874, when Gulf Coast shipping magnate Charles Morgan, who had his own grudge against the Galveston Wharf Company's monopoly control of that city's harbor, purchased the struggling Ship Channel Company and, within 2 years, had dredged a 12-foot deep channel connecting Houston to Clinton, a small port town below the city. The federal government formally took over Morgan's channel improvements in 1881, and after further delays, completed a dredged path through Galveston Bay and Buffalo Bayou to a turning basin above the town of Harrisburg, giving Houston, for the first time in its history, a genuine federally maintained route to the open Gulf, however modest its depth remained compared to Galveston's naturally superior harbor just down the coast. Galveston's dominance, the very thing Houston had spent 60 years quietly resenting, ended in a single Saturday afternoon. On September 8, 1900, a Category 4 hurricane made landfall directly on Galveston Island, with sustained winds exceeding 135 miles per hour, and a storm surge that ultimately crested at nearly 16 feet above a city whose highest natural point stood barely 8 feet above sea level. The United States Weather Bureau, only a decade old and working with primitive forecasting tools, had confidently predicted the storm would curve north into Florida rather than strike Texas at all, leaving Galveston's residents with almost no meaningful warning before the water arrived. By the time the storm passed, more than 3,600 buildings lay destroyed, including a Catholic orphanage where 90 children and 10 nuns drowned together, and the death toll across the island and the nearby mainland is now estimated at somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 people, making it, to this day, the deadliest natural disaster in the entire history of the United States. Survivors described the ocean itself seeming to rise up out of the ground beneath their homes rather than arriving as a wave from any single direction, and in the disaster's grim aftermath, the sheer volume of the dead forced rescue workers to load bodies onto barges for burial at sea, a plan abandoned within days when the corpses began washing back onto the beaches regardless. Galveston rebuilt, remarkably, constructing a 17-foot seawall and physically raising the grade of the entire city, including a 3,000-ton church jacked 5 feet into the air while services continued on schedule inside it. But the city's standing as the unrivaled commercial capital of Texas never recovered. Investors and shipping interests, having watched the state's grandest port city drown in a single afternoon, began quietly shifting their attention 50 miles inland to the swampy, mosquito-ridden bayou town that, unlike Galveston, did not sit directly exposed to the open Gulf. Houston seized the opening with a focus that bordered on obsession. Local civic and business leaders lobbied Congress relentlessly for the federal funding needed to finally deepen and widen Buffalo Bayou into a genuine, permanent, deep-draft ship channel capable of bringing ocean-going cargo vessels all the way inland to Houston's own docks, bypassing Galveston's harbor entirely. The Houston Ship Channel, dredged initially to a depth of 25 feet, formally opened on November 10, 1914, an engineering achievement that carved a permanent deepwater path from the very heart of the city 50 miles out to the Gulf of Mexico, and the Port of Houston Authority, established in 1927 to manage and continue expanding the channel, would go on to guide its steady widening and deepening across the following century until it became, by most measures, the busiest port in the United States by total tonnage. What made the timing of the channel's completion so consequential was a discovery that had already reshaped the entire regional economy 13 years earlier, roughly 90 miles to the east. On January 10, 1901, a drilling crew working for Captain Anthony F. Lucas struck oil at a low salt dome formation near Beaumont known as Spindletop, and the well erupted with a force nobody in the American petroleum industry had ever witnessed before, a column of crude roaring more than 150 feet into the air, and producing at its peak roughly 100,000 barrels a day, more than every other producing oil well in the United States, combined at that exact moment. News of the Lucas Gusher, as it came to be known, spread within days, and investors, speculators, and oilmen flooded into southeast Texas from across the entire country, transforming a state economy that had been built almost entirely on cotton, cattle, and small-scale agriculture into the epicenter of a genuinely new American industry within a matter of months. Companies born directly out of the Spindletop frenzy, the Texas Company, soon renamed Texaco, the JM, Guffey Petroleum Company, later Gulf Oil, and Humble Oil and Refining, which would eventually grow into Exxon, one of the largest corporations on the planet, all needed somewhere to refine their crude and ship their finished products to national and international markets. Houston, with its existing rail connections, its newly expanding port ambitions, and crucially, its brand new deepwater ship channel completed in 1914, offered exactly the infrastructure those companies needed at precisely the moment they needed it. By 1929, 40 separate oil companies had established offices in Houston, and refineries lined the banks of the ship channel in an unbroken industrial corridor, stretching from downtown all the way to the Gulf, employing, by that same year, more than a quarter of all manufacturing workers in the entire county. Houston had transformed itself, within less than 3 decades, from a swampy inland cotton port into what its own boosters would soon begin calling, with real justification, the energy capital of the world. That transformation compounded through the middle decades of the 20th century in ways that reinforced each other almost perfectly. The oil and petrochemical wealth flowing through the ship channel funded the construction of the Texas Medical Center, beginning in the 1940s and 1950s, which would grow into the largest concentrated medical complex on Earth, treating patients and training physicians from around the world on land purchased with philanthropic donations from the same oil fortunes that had built the refineries a few miles away. Air conditioning, still a genuine luxury in most of the country through the middle of the century, arrived in Houston's office buildings, hotels, and eventually private homes with a speed and thoroughness matched by almost nowhere else, transforming a city whose brutal, swampy summer humidity had once been considered a near-fatal deterrent to sustained economic activity into a place where indoor commerce, indoor shopping, and indoor daily life could simply proceed year-round regardless of what the weather outside was doing. The federal government added its own extraordinary vote of confidence in September 1961, when NASA selected a donated tract of coastal prairie southeast of the city, land given to the agency by Rice University, as the site for its new manned spacecraft center, later renamed the Johnson Space Center, the facility that would go on to house mission control for every American crewed spaceflight from Gemini through the Space Shuttle and beyond, permanently attaching the phrase Houston. We have a problem to the city's name in the global imagination, regardless of how many decades passed or how many other industries the city built around it. Houston's population climbed in near lockstep with all of this compounding growth, from roughly 45,000 residents in the 1880s to over 100,000 by 1910, past Texas's other major cities, to become the state's most populous city by 1930, and then, driven by the post-war oil boom and a wave of Gulf Coast petrochemical expansion through the 1950s and 1960s, into the millions by the 1970s. Underlying nearly all of that growth was a decision that set Houston apart from literally every other major American city then or since. It never adopted formal zoning laws at all. Voters rejected zoning proposals on multiple occasions across the 20th century, and the city instead developed an unusual patchwork of private deed restrictions, negotiated neighborhood by neighborhood between developers and residents, alongside city ordinances governing narrower issues like building height, lot size, and parking requirements, rather than the comprehensive, government-mandated zoning maps that dictated what could be built where in virtually every comparable American city. The result was a metropolis that could, and regularly did, permit a mid-rise apartment tower to rise directly beside a single-family bungalow neighborhood, with essentially none of the years-long approval battles that similar projects faced in cities with traditional zoning, giving Houston a genuine reputation among urban planners as one of the most permissive, fastest-building major cities in the entire country, capable of adding housing stock and commercial space at a pace and a price point that helped keep it, for decades, one of the more affordable large metros in America, even as its population kept climbing. Picture the Houston Ship Channel on a summer afternoon sometime in the early 1970s, near the peak of the post-war oil boom. Flare stacks burning off excess natural gas dot the horizon in every direction, along a refining and petrochemical corridor that, by this point, stretches unbroken for more than 25 miles from the edge of downtown to the Gulf, the largest concentration of petrochemical manufacturing capacity anywhere on the planet. Supertankers far too large to have ever navigated the bayou's original shallow, snag-choked channel that so frustrated Captain Auld a century earlier, now idle at anchor, waiting their turn to load and unload at docks built specifically to accommodate them. Downtown, glass office towers rise one after another to house the headquarters staff of oil majors and independent producers alike. Air conditioning units straining audibly against 95-degree afternoons, thick enough with humidity that stepping outside from any lobby feels, by more than one visitor's account, like walking directly into a warm, wet towel. At the Manned Spacecraft Center 25 miles southeast, flight controllers in white short-sleeved shirts monitor telemetry from astronauts orbiting the Earth, or, within the decade, walking on the surface of the moon, broadcasting the city's name into households around the entire world every time a mission update crackled over network television. Out past the last refinery tank farms, the flat coastal prairie stretches uninterrupted toward the Gulf, low, marshy, and almost entirely undefended against the one kind of disaster this exact geography had already proven. At Galveston, 70 years earlier, it was catastrophically vulnerable to. That vulnerability reasserted itself with a violence that dwarfed even the most pessimistic modern projections on August 25th, 2017, when Hurricane Harvey made landfall as a Category 4 storm near Rockport, Texas, roughly 200 miles southwest of Houston, before stalling almost completely over the upper Texas coast for the better part of 4 days. Rather than moving through and dissipating the way most hurricanes do within a day or two of landfall, Harvey essentially parked itself over southeast Texas and continued drawing moisture off the unusually warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, dumping rain in totals that meteorologists had genuinely never recorded before anywhere in the continental United States. Cedar Bayou, on Houston's outskirts, recorded 51. 88 inches of rainfall in under 5 days, a new national record for any tropical storm system, while a broader swath of southeast Texas received in excess of 30 inches and some isolated pockets exceeded 60. In total, more than 20 trillion gallons of water fell across Texas and Louisiana during the event, enough, by one federal estimate, to supply the entire water needs of New York City for more than 5 decades. Houston's flat, poorly draining coastal geography, the same fundamental characteristic that had made Buffalo Bayou so difficult to navigate for the Allen brothers' steamboats in 1837, meant that rainfall on this scale had almost nowhere to go, and it simply accumulated block by block across an urban area whose rapid, permissive, zoning-free development over the preceding half-century had paved over enormous stretches of the prairie wetlands that once absorbed exactly this kind of deluge. The flooding that followed was catastrophic on a scale that even hardened emergency responders struggled to describe. More than 300,000 structures and 500,000 vehicles across the Houston metropolitan area were damaged or destroyed by floodwater. Roughly 80% of affected homeowners carried no flood insurance whatsoever, and more than 30,000 people were displaced from their homes, many rescued directly from rooftops in flooded neighborhoods by volunteers piloting personal fishing boats, an improvised flotilla that would become known informally as the Cajun Navy. At the Johnson Space Center itself, more than 42 inches of rain fell on the campus, flooding several outlying buildings, including the video and photography laboratory that processes imagery downlinked from astronauts aboard the International Space Station, forcing staff to shelter on site for days on cots lined up along the hallways, while Mission Control itself, remarkably, never lost operational capability throughout the entire storm. Statewide, Harvey killed more than 100 people and caused an estimated $125 to $160 billion in damage, a figure that tied it, depending on the specific accounting method used, with Hurricane Katrina as the single costliest tropical storm in American history, and made it, without any serious competition, the costliest natural disaster Texas itself had ever experienced. Harvey exposed, in the most literal and expensive way imaginable, the tension embedded in the very growth model that had made Houston one of the fastest building, most permissively developed major cities in the country. The absence of zoning had let Houston sprawl across its coastal floodplain faster and more cheaply than almost any comparable American metro. But it had also allowed enormous amounts of new construction, including entire subdivisions, to rise on land that flood maps and hydrologists had long identified as genuinely unsuitable for it. Land that, absent a formal zoning code with the teeth to say no, developers were largely free to build on anyway, as long as they cleared narrower engineering and permitting hurdles. Decades of unrestrained groundwater pumping to supply that same sprawling population had also caused significant portions of the Houston area to sink, in some spots by more than 10 feet over the course of the 20th century, a slow-motion subsidence that left large sections of the region measurably lower, and therefore measurably more flood-prone, than they had been when the Allen brothers first surveyed the bayou nearly 2 centuries earlier. City and regional officials in the years since Harvey have pushed through a series of major flood mitigation projects, including new and expanded stormwater detention basins, buyout programs for the most repeatedly flooded homes, and a long-debated proposal for a massive coastal storm surge barrier, sometimes nicknamed the Ike Dike, that would attempt to do for the entire Galveston Bay region what no single engineering project has ever fully managed to do here before. Hold back the water for good, rather than simply learning, again, to live with the damage after the fact. Houston today is home to roughly 4 million residents within the city proper and nearly 9 million across its full metropolitan region, a metro area larger than 35 entire American states, anchored by an economy that has, in the decades since the 1980s, oil bust taught the city a painful lesson about depending too heavily on a single industry, diversified deliberately into healthcare, aerospace, shipping and logistics, and higher education, even as oil, gas, and petrochemicals remain the single largest identifiable piece of the regional economy and the reason more energy company headquarters call Houston home than any other city on Earth. The ship channel the Allen brothers first bluffed into legitimacy with a single steamboat. In 1837, now moves more cargo tonnage annually than any other port in the United States, a permanent, dredged, thoroughly engineered waterway that bears almost no resemblance to the shallow, snag-choked bayou Captain Auld once had to navigate in reverse for 6 miles simply to turn his ship around. And the flat, swampy, poorly draining coastal prairie that has always been Houston's single greatest natural liability, the characteristic that drowned Galveston in 1900 and drowned a third of Houston itself in 2017, remains exactly as flat, exactly as swampy, and exactly as poorly draining today as it was when the Karankawa and Atacapa lived across it for generations, before either city existed at all. Houston has spent nearly 200 years proving that a city can outbuild, outdredge, and out-engineer almost any geographic disadvantage thrown at it, transforming a mosquito-choked bayou into the energy capital of the world through nothing but persistence, capital, and a near-total absence of anyone telling it no. Whether that same relentless, permission-light growth model can ever fully engineer its way around the one disadvantage it has never managed to solve, a flat coastal floodplain that the Gulf of Mexico periodically insists on reclaiming, however many billions of dollars the city spends trying to convince it otherwise, is the question the fourth largest city in America is still, more than a century after Spindletop, trying to answer.